The early years of World War I can be characterized as a clash of 20th century technology with 19th century tactics. In earlier wars, a strong, swift offense, led by troops on horseback, often had been enough to secure victory in battle. The soldiers of World War I, however, came up against new killing machines of amazing efficiency. Defensive forces could use modern firepower, such as machine guns and rapid-fire artillery, to stop advancing soldiers. Ripped apart by machine guns, hand grenades, or artillery shells, and choked by poisonous gases, soldiers found that heroism came at a great price. This resulted in many ineffective battles, with huge casualty figures on both sides. In the first day of fighting in the Battle of the Somme, the British lost some 20,000 troops in a single day of combat. It was not until the final year of the war that the major armies made effective steps in adapting to the modern battlefield as they started to harness the numerous new technologies. In this screencast, we will look at some of the weapons of the modern war created by the industrialized nations and their impact on World War I. Machine guns. The 1914 machine gun, usually positioned on a flat tripod, would require a gun crew of 4 to 6 operators. In theory, they could fire 400 to 600 small caliber rounds per minute, a figure that was to more than double by the war's end, with rounds fed via a fabric belt or a metal strip. The reality, however, was that these early machine guns would rapidly overheat and become inoperative without the aid of cooling mechanisms. They were consequently fired in short rather than sustained bursts. Cooling generally took one of two forms: water-cooled, and increasingly as the war developed, air-cooled. Water jackets would be provided for the former, which held around 1 gallon of liquid, and air vents would be built into the machine gun for the latter. The water-cooled machine guns would still overheat relatively quickly, sometimes within 2 minutes, with the consequence that large supplies of water would need to be on hand in the heat of the battle. And when these ran out, it was not unknown for a machine gun crew to solve the problem by urinating into the jacket. However, the use of machine guns and their rapid fire capabilities were an effective weapon in controlling soldiers running across no man's land and trying to storm the enemy trenches. Flamethrower, which brought terror to French and British soldiers when used by the German army in the early phases of the First World War in 1914 and 1915, and which was quickly adopted by both the French and the British, was by no means a particularly innovative weapon. The basic idea of the flamethrower is to spread fire by launching burning fuel. The earliest flamethrowers date as far back as the 5th century BC. They were highly effective at clearing trenches at a local level. They were of practically no wider benefit. Their use was consequently abandoned. However, the French developed their own portable one-man flamethrower of a superior build to the German model. It was used in trench attacks during 1917 and 1918. The Germans then produced a lightweight modified version of their Flammenwerfer, the Wax, in 1917, which had the benefit of self-igniting. Although it was popularly believed that the German army was the first to use poisonous gases, it was in fact initially deployed by the French. In the first month of the war, August of 1914, they fired tear gas grenades against the Germans. Nevertheless, the German army was the first to give serious study to the development of chemical weapons and the first to use it on a large scale. The debut of the first poison gas, however, in this instance, chlorine, came on 22 April 1915, at the start of the Second Battle of Ypres. Puzzled, but suspicious, the French suspected that the cloud masked an advance by German infantry, and ordered their men to stand to, that is, to mount the trench fire step in readiness for probable attack. The effects of the chlorine gas were severe. Within seconds of inhaling its vapor, it destroyed the victim's respiratory organs, bringing on choking attacks. When the French and the British developed their own chlorine weapons, the Germans developed phosgene. Phosgene caused much less coughing, with the result that more of it was inhaled. It was consequently adopted by both the German and the Allied armies. Phosgene often had a delayed effect. Apparently healthy soldiers were taken down with phosgene gas poisoning up to 48 hours after inhalation. Mustard gas was the next weapon that was developed. Mustard gas is an almost odorless chemical that is distinguished by serious blisters it causes both internally and externally on its victims that are brought on several hours after exposure. Protection against mustard gas proved more difficult than against the other poisonous gas. The use of mustard gas also proved to have mixed benefits. While it inflicted serious injury upon the enemy, the chemical remained potent in the soil for weeks after release, making capture of infected trenches a dangerous undertaking for friendly forces. The types of protection initially handed out to troops in World War I, following the first use of chlorine gas in April of 1915, were primitive in the extreme. 100,000 wads of cotton pads were quickly manufactured and made available. These were dipped in a solution of bicarbonate of soda and held over the face. Soldiers were also advised that holding a urine-drenched cloth over their face would serve in an emergency to protect against the effects of chlorine. Ugh, gross. However, by 1918, soldiers on both sides were far better prepared to meet the ever-present threat of a gas attack, as you can see in the picture on the screen. Filter respirators using charcoal or antidote chemicals were the norm and proved highly effective, although working in a trench while wearing such respirators generally proved difficult and tiring. As you can see from the chart, the Germans' use of poisonous gas chemical warfare was far more effective, and thus the Allies suffered far greater casualties. The British losing 68,000 soldiers to injury and death. The Russians on the Eastern Front lost 56,000 soldiers. The French 8,000, while the Germans lost only 9,000. One interesting note is that the United States lost only about 1,400, almost 1,500 soldiers to poisonous gas and its effect. This can be explained largely from the fact that from beginning to end, we really only fought about 6 months in this conflict. Even though we declared war in April of 1917, we really were not ready to fight in the war until the spring of 1918, and then the war is over by November of 1918. So as a result, our real involvement in the war was really only from about May of 1918 until November, a span of about 6 months. So therefore, we suffer far fewer casualties in the conflict, and you can see this was reflected from the casualties and poisonous gases as well. The first combat tank was ready by January of 1916 and was demonstrated to a high-powered audience. Convinced, Lloyd George, the Minister of Munitions, ordered production of the heavy Mark I model to begin. Meanwhile, the French, who were aware of the British tank experimentation, proceeded with their own. Shortly afterwards, 36 tanks led the way in an attack at Flers. Although the attack was itself successful, the sudden appearance of the new weapon stunned their German opponents. These early tanks proved notoriously unreliable. In part, they were unreliable because the British deployed them before they were truly battle-ready in an attempt to break the trench stalemate. They often broke down and became ditched, that is, stuck in a muddy trench, more often than anticipated. Conditions for the tank crews were also far from ideal. The heat generated inside the tank was tremendous, and fumes often nearly choked the men inside. Nevertheless, the first tank operators proved their mettle by operating under what amounted to appalling conditions. In many regards, in what many regard as the first truly successful demonstration of the potential of the tank, the entire British Tank Corps saw action at the Battle of Cambrai on November 20th, 1917, although the French can lay claim to its early successful use at Malmaison. In a sweepingly successful start to the battle, 12 miles of the German front was breached, with the capture of 10,000 German prisoners, 123 guns, and 281 machine guns. Unfortunately for the British, this enormous initial success was effectively cancelled out in the German counterattacks because the British did not possess sufficient infantry troops to exploit the breach they had created. Nevertheless, the successful use of tanks at Cambrai restored dwindling faith in the tank development. The U.S. Army took note and undertook developments of its own tank series. It also acted as a stimulus to the German Army as well. They too began to increase production of their own models, although they never pretended enthusiasm for their cause. They'll play a much greater role in World War II, especially for the Germans. The U.S. Tank Corps adopted the use of the French Renault tanks, light 6-ton vehicles designed for close infantry support. Around 200 of these were used in action at Saint-Mihiel and again at the Battle of Meuse-Argonne during the late September, early October campaigns of the war, which proved to be the decisive battles in the war. Aircraft technology was a little over a decade old when Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination in late June 1914 ultimately resulted in the outbreak of the Great War. Initially deemed of little use to the armed services other than in reconnaissance role, aircraft development exploded during wartime. For example, France had fewer than 140 aircraft when her war against Germany began. 4 years later, that number had ballooned to approximately 4,500 aircraft. While this may seem to be an impressive number, it does not give a true indication of the amount of aircraft involved. During the war, the French produced no less than 68,000 aircraft. 52,000 of them were lost in battle, a horrendous loss rate of 77%. The period between 1914 and 1918 saw not only a tremendous production of aircraft, but also a tremendous development in aircraft technology. Although the use of aircraft for both strategic bombing and tactical bombing evolved as the war progressed, a lot of the early fighting in the war from the air involved individual planes firing each other with machine guns or trying to fly low and strafe using machine guns against the enemy lines. This was a very dangerous tactic and often resulted in planes being shot down, crashing, and individual pilots who fought these one-on-one dogfights in the air became legends during World War I. As you can see, the German ace, Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Bloody Red Baron, led all World War I flying aces with 80, while American Eddie Rickenbacker had 26 kills. The statistics that you're viewing are kind of a little misleading. The U-boat is an abbreviation of German word Unterseeboot, which when translated into English means undersea boat. When the First World War began, the German armed forces had 29 U-boats at their disposal. In the first 10 weeks of the conflict, they sank 5 British cruisers. Between October 1916 and January 1917, a grand total of 1.4 million tons of Allied shipping was lost to U-boats. A lot of this was American. These losses were eventually curtailed when the Allies introduced escorted convoys with merchant ships surrounded by military vessels.